In 1947, the U.S. military made a public statement that lasted exactly 4 hours. They claimed to have recovered a flying disc. Then it vanished from official records for 47 years. What happened in those 4 hours? What forced one of America's most secure military bases to reverse course so dramatically? And why did the government wait nearly 5 decades to explain what they said they'd recovered? The Roswell incident isn't just about a crash, it's about what happens when institutional power meets unexplainable events. The classified documents, the witness testimony, the cover-up timeline, they paint a picture of something the government wanted buried. But the evidence is still there. And what it reveals about power, secrecy, and the truth might change how you understand what really happens behind closed military doors. The morning of July 8, 1947, started like any other day in the high desert of New Mexico. But by noon, that day would become the most controversial 24 hours in modern military history. W. Brazel, a rancher operating the Foster Ranch approximately 75 miles north of Roswell, discovered something scattered across his property that he couldn't identify. The debris included lightweight, flexible material that witnesses, military personnel with security clearances, described as impossibly strong, bearing symbols or markings that made no sense under any conventional analysis. What Brazel found was significant enough that he reported it to the authorities. What happens next is where the official story begins to fracture. The 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic bomb-equipped unit in the world at that time, initiated what was classified as an intelligence operation. Colonel William Blanchard authorized a press release. The language matters here because it tells us what the military initially believed they'd recovered. The statement read, "The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of one of the local ranchers." That phrasing, "many rumors became a reality," not "we recovered a classified balloon," indicates the military's initial assessment of what they'd found. But within 4 hours, that press release was pulled. A new statement emerged: weather balloon, nothing classified, nothing extraordinary. The question that's never been adequately answered is why. What separates Roswell from typical UFO folklore is the credibility of the witnesses. These weren't conspiracy theorists or attention seekers. These were military officers with security clearances, trained observers operating within institutional hierarchies that demanded accountability. Major Jesse Marcel was the base intelligence officer. He was the first to physically examine the recovered debris. In 1947, testimony and decades of subsequent interviews, including deathbed statements, Marcel maintained a consistent account. The material wasn't from conventional aircraft. It couldn't be cut with ordinary tools. It bent in ways metal shouldn't bend. The symbols impressed into fragments resembled nothing in any reference material available to him. He stated explicitly, it was not anything from this earth. Glenn Dennis was a mortician in Roswell. In July 1947, military personnel contacted him with an unusual request. They wanted to know about preservation procedures for small humanoid remains. Multiple bodies. Dennis provided detailed accounts of the conversation, including descriptions of the beings: small stature, unusual proportions, non-human morphology. Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr., the major's son, examined the debris as a child and described it in corroborating detail decades later. What's significant isn't individual testimony. Memory is unreliable. What's significant is that multiple witnesses operating in isolated circles without coordinated narrative management described identical material properties and physical characteristics. If this was misidentification, Why would trained military observers all misidentify the same objects in identical ways? That pattern, the consistency across independent sources, is what forensic investigators call corroborating evidence. Here's where institutional behavior becomes telling. In 1947, the government made a choice: deny publicly, classify privately. For nearly 5 decades, official channels maintained that nothing unusual occurred. Military brass issued statements, investigations were closed, witnesses were discouraged from public testimony. The wreckage was cataloged and stored, its disposition remaining sealed. Then, in 1994, 47 years later, the Air Force released a document titled the Roswell Report. The explanation: the debris came from Project Mogul, a classified high-altitude balloon surveillance program designed to detect Soviet nuclear detonations. The balloon arrays used radar-reflective materials and carried acoustic sensors. According to the official narrative, the military simply misidentified a classified balloon as something extraordinary, made a hasty press release, then spent 5 decades covering it up, rather than simply stating the truth. But here's what doesn't align. If the military knew in 1947 that this was their own classified balloon program, why the press release claiming a flying disc? Why not classify it immediately? Why wait 47 years to explain something they understood from day one? The official explanation accounts for some anomalies. The material properties could match Mogul balloon debris, but it doesn't account for why the government's institutional behavior was so inconsistent with what they claim they always knew. Classification timelines in the declassified record show that sensitive Cold War programs were routinely declassified within 20 to 30 years of operational obsolescence. Project Mogul was obsolete by the 1950s. Yet Roswell remained sealed until 1994. That 47-year delay itself requires explanation. Forget the extraterrestrial question for a moment. Focus instead on what we can actually verify: institutional behavior. The government made a statement they immediately contradicted. They classified information they claimed was routine. They maintained that classification for nearly half a century despite technical obsolescence. They discouraged witness testimony. They created alternate explanations that didn't fully account for documented observations. This pattern, secrecy, contradiction, delayed transparency, doesn't prove what crashed at Roswell. It proves that powerful institutions will conceal information they deem threatening to institutional stability, regardless of whether that information involves extraterrestrial contact or merely classified military operations. The Mogul explanation is internally consistent on technical details, but fails to explain the institutional response. If this was a classified balloon program, why the narrative contradiction? Why not simply acknowledge it was classified and leave it at that? The government's own behavior, the cover story layered on top of the cover-up, the decades of misdirection, suggests they were hiding something more significant than a surveillance balloon. Whether that something is non-human technology, a foreign advanced aircraft, or a military operation too sensitive to acknowledge, the evidence points to one conclusion: the official narrative about Roswell has never been the actual truth. The pattern becomes clear when you stop asking what crashed and start asking why telling the truth appeared so dangerous.
The Roswell case exemplifies how pattern seeking can override parsimonious explanation. Consider the methodology flaws. Witness testimony decades after the event is subject to well-documented memory reconstruction, source confusion, and confabulation effects. The consistent details across accounts actually reflect a shared cultural narrative. The Roswell story was extensively publicized by 1947, contaminating subsequent witness memory. The 4-hour press release window is not mysterious. It reflects standard military protocol of initial reports, verification, and correction based on intelligence assessment. The Mogul explanation directly addresses the material properties. Mogul balloon arrays used radar-reflective aluminum and balsa, exactly matching witness descriptions of thin, lightweight metal. The symbols witnesses described were identification codes on reflector panels, mundane in context, mysterious to untrained observers. The 47-year classification delay is entirely consistent with Cold War security timelines. Mogul was a highly classified intelligence program whose operational details remained sensitive long after its technical obsolescence. Regarding the dummy claim, the criticism conflates timelines. Witnesses describing bodies occurred in 1947. The Air Force's 1997 identification of dummies used in 1950s tests was a separate investigation into anthropomorphic recovery rumors, not contradictory timeline evidence. The most parsimonious explanation remains: debris from a classified surveillance program, military security response, institutional opacity regarding classified operations, and decades of folk mythology layering extraterrestrial interpretation onto prosaic materials. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Recovered non-human technology requires verification independent of memory-dependent witness testimony.